So let's talk about The Boogeyman. Now, this is based off of a short story in Stephen King's Night Shift, which I happen to have, and I came home and read it, or reread it, because this is actually my favorite Stephen King short story collection. When it comes to Stephen King, I think short fiction is his best work, and yeah, those are typically my favorites. Now, the short story was actually originally published in the magazine Cavalier in 1973, and then it was published later in 1978 in this short story collection. So just a little tiny rant. It's not a Possessed by Horror video if I don't have like a mini rant every now and again. So I know I'm gonna upset some people by saying, because people love to think that I'm a hater, and you know what, sometimes I absolutely am. I love Stephen King, don't get me wrong, but I do feel like we are kind of stuck in this era of making adaptations of Stephen King's work when there are so many other great stories out there. Now, granted, I am happy it's coming from a short story from him. Like I said, those are typically my favorites, and it's something different. Obviously, we've had remakes of pretty much all of his movies besides Misery, and probably for the best. But I just don't know if we need, I mean, again, this is the whole cycle of like, well, we don't need anything, right? Whatever. I'm just saying that we are stuck in this loop of like constantly making adaptations of Stephen King things. And there are plenty that are great. I love The Mist. Misery is my favorite. Even Christine, you know, I love that one too. But I'm just like, can we do some other stuff? Okay, so I want to point out that this movie is kind of loosely based on this story, because the story itself is very short, and it's basically just the one interaction between the therapist and Lester Billings. That's his name, right? So it's a very short story. Like, there's not a lot to go on, but they then expanded it for the sake of the movie. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, so let me just sum it up by saying I'm just kind of like, when I see Stephen adapted by a story from Stephen King, I'm just not as excited anymore as I used to be. I mean, we haven't adapted anything from his recent works. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know there was Cell. That was one of his more recent, obviously in the century of his books, and that was adapted into a movie. But beyond that, I'm not sure what recently has come out. Maybe, I know there's some like series that has been adapted from his works and things like that. But anyway, on that note, I will be doing a whole ranking tier list video of every Stephen King adaptation movie-wise. So look forward to that. There's some that I need to watch and rewatch, so stay tuned. Anyway, let's get into The Boogeyman as a movie itself. I'll do a little bit of a comparison with the short story as well, since, you know, I have it and I read it. So The Boogeyman is directed by Rob Savage, which I actually didn't even know going into the movie. I had very low expectations going in, because based on the trailer that I don't even think I paid attention to like the entire trailer, if I'm being honest. So I didn't really have anything to go off of. I knew it was kind of just looked like a generic horror movie, but it's directed by Rob Savage, and that name popped up at the very end, obviously, and I was like, oh, I love Rob Savage. That's weird. Just interesting that I didn't know. So he did Host and Dashcam, both found footage movies that I absolutely love. I know Dashcam's a little bit controversial, but Host is obviously known to be very scary and short at only an hour, which is great. And so I was surprised that The Boogeyman is on his roster, because it's just so different from all of his other work. Also surprising about The Boogeyman is it was written by Scott Beck and Brian Woods, who wrote A Quiet Place. So both of those facts kind of threw me off a little bit, just because of what the movie actually was, like with The Boogeyman being kind of your straightforward generic horror movie. This isn't going to be on everyone's top list, you know what I mean? It's just kind of your straightforward standard type horror flick, which is fine. It's like a popcorn movie, PG-13, you go and you watch it and it's fun, but it's not anything to write home about. Actually, it was originally going to be straight to streaming on Hulu, but it did really well with audiences or, you know, test screenings, and so they decided to give it a theatrical release. Do I think that was absolutely necessary? No, but I do like the awareness, especially with who's behind it, with Rob Savage and Brian Woods and Scott Beck, that it got a theatrical release. I'm happy for that purpose. Also, yes, there is another movie called The Boogeyman from 2005, which is a very nostalgic movie for me personally. Go watch it. It's hilariously bad, but in a fun way. So if you like that era and that kind of, you want that kind of vibe, then go watch it. It's fun. So The Boogeyman follows high school student Sadie Harper and her younger sister Sawyer, who are still reeling from the recent death of their mother. They're not getting much support from their father, Will, who's a therapist who's dealing with his own intense pain. A desperate patient unexpectedly shows up at their house seeking help, and he leaves behind a terrifying supernatural entity that preys on families and feeds on the suffering of its victims. My initial impression of this movie is it's a PG-13 version of Smile meets The Babadook. So both of those movies are much darker in tone and more brutal, I guess. Well, Babadook's not like too heavy. It's spooky, you know, it's one of those creepy movies. This kind of is in the same vein as that. Smile is obviously much more violent and gory. So this is like the toned down version of both of those things. And I think the story and its meaning for The Boogeyman is very much straightforward. And it's basically a story about grief, which is why I compare it to The Babadook, because that has been done before. You know, the supernatural entity follows people who have tragedy in their lives. And there's very much representation for handling grief. Now, I will say, as a new mother watching this, very dark, and that was difficult, and also as someone who is grieving myself. My dad passed in April, so it's very much it hits close to home, you know, this movie being about grief and, you know, the children aspect and things like that. I will say something about this movie felt very 2010 to 2015 era of horror, and I think if it came out then, it would have been received a lot better. I've seen some people say this is disappointing. I'm not really sure what the actual ratings are for this. I didn't look at it, or Rotten Tomatoes or anything. I'm not sure. Maybe editing me will put in a little thing here to show you. I don't know. But I think it would have been pretty well received back then, maybe, you know, 10, 15 years ago. So some of it just like feels dated, not in a bad way necessarily. And it almost feels like that was intentional. I'm not sure. Okay, so we have the good and the bad. I will say there is more bad on my list than good, but I also want to say I actually enjoyed this movie a lot more than I thought I would. I was very surprised by that, because going in, I had very low expectations. It looked generic. It kind of was generic, but because I didn't have any other expectations, maybe that's why it just ended up not being that bad for me. It is kind of a teen drama, so there's like high school drama within there. So I'd say this is a great movie for teenagers or teens looking to get into horror, or like an intro to horror movie. I think this one would be really great. So with the good, I actually really liked the character development and the story development in this. I feel like they spent just enough time on all of the characters for us to really care and attach to them. And I feel like maybe that's because I'm more of an emotional state right now, you know, new mom, grieving, things like that. So maybe it was because of those things that I felt a little bit more connected to the story and the characters themselves. And despite it being cliche, I cared about them. You know, have we seen this kind of dynamic before with this family who's grieving a parent? Absolutely, especially in a supernatural horror movie. But it was easy to follow. It was just a very straightforward story, and I liked the story development and where it went. It had a good monster. I appreciate the Boogeyman, and I really liked what they did with how little they showed of it up until the very end, which I feel like is very important in a supernatural horror movie, especially a PG-13 one. You don't want to show too much, because you need to have some kind of mystery behind the being, you know? You need to have that effect of just barely seeing enough of it, and I feel like they did that for the most part. They were very reserved with how much you actually got to see of it up until the very end, and then it just got even better personally, you know, kind of like Smile, where the movie was kind of standard cliche for a while, but then it like gets better in the end. This is a great spooky house supernatural movie. Like I said, it's kind of cliche, but sometimes we're in the mood for just like a spooky house. And this is definitely one I could see being a casual watch for me, where it's a deep movie for me. Like it hits home for me, but it's still like a very, you know, average, just easy to watch supernatural horror movie in a haunted house, not even haunted house, in a spooky house. They live in a big house, so you got those moments, and it's good in that aspect. I will say I cried in the end of this, and that was not embarrassing. I don't want to say embarrassing, but I will never judge anyone who cries in a movie theater no matter what the movie is, because you never know why they're crying. You know what I mean? Like if anyone saw me crying at this movie, they'd probably be like, what are you doing? I was the only one in my row, so luckily no one saw me. But I was like you know, trying to keep it together still. So this movie definitely is a lot for me personally, but I think that's a positive. I think it, you know, is a great representation of grief and letting go and, you know, having the supernatural entity kind of representing grief, like in the Babadook. I like that. I like that symbolism. Okay, that's pretty much it for the good. That's what I enjoyed about it. The kind of like bigger picture aspects of this movie I thought were pretty decent. So let's get into like the nitpicky things, things that I thought weren't so good. Like I said, it's cliche. Sometimes the cliches and the tropes kind of go a little bit too far. But again, like I said, it kind of feels self-aware in that. I'm not sure if that was something that they were going for, but something about it felt self-aware. But it is full of cliches and tropes galore. So speaking of that, jump scares, lots of those. Apparently some scenes were so scary that audiences were still screaming over dialogue that happened in the next scene, so they had to re-edit some scenes to give the audience time to kind of recover from certain scenes. And I have a feeling that they were jump scares, which to me is less effective, because if it was so horrifying that people were screaming, that's one thing. They were startled into screaming, that's something else. So for me, that's not as impressive. It's not that scary, guys, trust me. If you watch horror movies all the time, this isn't gonna be like super scary. There were moments that were cool and creepy, but they did pack it full of jump scares when I think it would have been better had they held back from those. Put in a couple, that's fine, it's that kind of movie. But then scare us with like visuals and like just, you know, the spookiness of it. Seeing the boogeyman in the closet, you know, we did get some of those without the jump scares, but then it was kind of followed by one. So like I said, the characters and the story development were really good, but I do feel like the pacing was a little bit strange and kind of all over the place. We have like in the middle of the movie this like lighthearted high school drama, and it's just kind of strange. There's a purpose to it, like it does lead somewhere horrifying, like there's, you know, there's a need for it, but it was kind of just out of nowhere, and then it got really lighthearted all of a sudden with like the music and just certain aspects. I don't know. It was like right in the middle of the movie after we've already been like tension building and things. There were definitely plot dumps and over explanations in this. Again, that's very standard for these kind of horror movies that are very run-of-the-mill average. They're gonna kind of over explain things to you and like have characters specifically there just to explain things, and then they kind of just fizzle out. There's like a line, you know, I'm your best friend, to explain their relationship, and you know, I hate those scenarios. It's like, who cares? We know they're friends or something more. It doesn't matter. They're, you know, they have a relationship of some kind. We don't need to have the explanation that she's actually her best friend. It's like, you know, when movies say like, oh, I'm your sister, I'll do anything for you, stuff like that. You know, no one says that in real life. The tone of this movie definitely leans more towards the Bye Bye Man, Ouija, those kind of movies, which sometimes is fun time. You know, I like rewatching the Bye Bye Man. I don't know if I'll rewatch Ouija. Ouija Origin of Evil is different. That's a better movie. But you know, those cheesy kind of movies, tropey movies, there's an audience for it, but they typically aren't like incredible. They're not amazing. And again, like I said, this isn't going to be on everyone's top 10 list for the year, but it is very much one of those type of, I don't want to say lighthearted, because like I said, it's about grief. So it is kind of heavy. You know, if you've ever lost someone, especially a parent, it might lean a little heavy, or even if you're a parent. So it's not as light as like the Bye Bye Man, but it's still, the tone of it kind of reminds me of that, especially with like the teen horror. This definitely also leans very teen horror. There are some unrealistic things that a lot of cliche horror movies do, or, you know, they turn into cliches within horror movies that I'm just not a fan of personally. I like it to be addressed. So when a shotgun goes off in a closed room, you're gonna lose your hearing for a little bit. And they don't display that at all. You know, they don't explain that, you know. There is an address in this movie, 217 Oak Drive. 217 representing The Shining, if you know, the room in The Shining. This one's a little bit more appropriate because this is based on a Stephen King movie, or book, story, whatever, short story. So I understand the reference, but again, with another Shining reference, why is it always The Shining? Why is it always The Shining? Why? And they always, if there has to be a number in a horror movie, they're going 217. And it's like, we get it. That's an easy way to reference The Shining. There's blood, you know, a lot of blood. It's the elevator scene. If there's a creepy girl in the hall, it's the twin girls. It's like, it's always something relating back to The Shining in so many horror movies. I should do a whole deep dive into horror movies that do that, and like our obsession with The Shining for some reason. It's just getting a little bit old. That's, you know, last rant of the video. The last bad thing about this movie would have to be the 4 teenagers in the back of my theater who talked the whole time, and then as they were leaving, dumped popcorn on each other and just left a whole mess of popcorn for the employees to clean up. That would be the last thing I would say. Listen, when I walked in and I knew that they were going to be loud, to an extent, I was like, go for it. Have at. This is the movie to do it. It is the middle of the day. We're at the mall and we're watching a PG-13 movie. You guys have fun, you know? I get it. This is the movie, the time, and the place to do it. Luckily, there was like 4 other people in the theater, including myself, besides these 4 teenagers. But then they just kept going. They kept pushing it and like, you know, laughing really loud, talking over very important scenes in this movie. Granted, it's, you know, they can talk over a lot of this movie. It's a straightforward movie, but they're talking over a lot of scenes. Also, in the end, they started shining their flashlight in the theater and like taking flash photography in the back for some reason. I don't know what of, but it was flashing towards the screen. So I'm not sure. So although there's plenty that I see like wrong with this movie, it's not like wrong. I actually enjoyed it a lot more as like a simple, straightforward type supernatural horror movie. I thought it was pretty solid for a PG-13 movie and everything. Surprisingly, I enjoyed it more than I thought. I can't, you know, really explain specifically why. I talked about like the bigger picture things, the good characters. I like the story. It's as simple as that. It is just fine though, so I can see a lot of people probably not loving this movie, and it'll be kind of a nothing movie to a lot of people. But it's like an easy, familiar, well done spooky watch. You know, it's like something that's not too scary. It's not too deep. It's like a little deep, you know, but it's nothing like too extreme. It's, you know, it's an easy, familiar watch. It's like something we've already seen before, and sometimes that is a really fun watch. I don't think it needs a theater experience personally unless you have free time and this is kind of up your alley, but this movie is pretty much probably exactly what you would expect from this movie, and I think it will kind of be more forgettable for the year despite it being a Stephen King adaptation, because it doesn't scream Stephen King adaptation to me. And again, I'm kind of done with that. Let's move on a little bit. Oh, for the story, I guess I should reference, you know, I said I was gonna compare it a little bit to the story. The story, you know, it's if you've read it, you know, there some shocking language used, and the perspective, the Lester Billings character, not a fan. He's obviously a very unlikable character, especially in today's world. But the story itself is very simple. Like I said, it just follows the therapist and Lester Billings going to him to talk about his tragedies and kind of leaving behind this entity in their house. So that is everything that's in this story. There were some direct quotes from the story, but mostly they changed a lot of things about that interaction and then obviously added a bunch to it to make a horror movie out of it. The short story is like 6 pages or something. It's really short, really digestible, and easy read, you know. I don't necessarily recommend it. The story itself, it gets a little punchy in the end. I like it, but it's not like my favorite short story from Stephen King. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Boogeyman. I would love to hear your thoughts if you've seen it already, or, you know, is this kind of up your alley? I have a feeling this one's going to not be polarizing because, again, it's a very generic horror movie, but I'm sure there's going to be some people who like it and some that hate it. So tell me what side you're on in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.